You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi, and this week we are in the Haftarah of parashat Vaera. And unlike last week, this time everyone's more or less reading the same thing. A very slight difference between the majority and the Yemenites by one verse, nothing too serious. And this week we have a chapter that, for me, as an historian, is always fun to work with, because we can actually pinpoint when the prophecy is going on, not only from the position of the date, but also the actual historical event that was going on. And if I'm not mistaken, we are going to have something very close to this as well in other places. But right now we are in a chapter that specifically touches on things that I've been studying the last couple of months. And it has to do with the demise of the Egyptian empire, even though I to some degree don't like calling it an empire, but we'll talk about the background of Egypt in a moment. I understand why most people do call it empire. I prefer to call it a kingdom, because when you talk about empires, you usually think mostly about Assyria, Babylon, the Persians, the Romans. Egypt mostly stayed in Africa, even though we have a lot of data that shows that they went all the way up into Syria. I was actually sitting with one of my professors, and we kind of looked at a whole bunch of inscriptions that we actually find Egyptian inscriptions all the way into Syria, almost on the border of what we'd call Babylon, Assyria. So the Egyptians did invade north of where they lived. They also invaded south. But Egypt mostly stayed in its own area. Now, Egypt is a really interesting thing, because there were basically, depending on the period, but there was always several powers in the north, and there was always Egypt in the south. And that's part of the discussion. Basically, what was going on was that Egypt kept on either expanding. One of my professors loves calling it like a lung. It would expand up and down, or it would shrink into itself. And Egypt knew a lot of different periods. I mean, there's the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. New Kingdom usually is what most of us discuss, because it relates closer to the Bible, because it's more the time of the Exodus, before the Exodus, after the Exodus, times of Judea, King David, Judea, Israel, and so on. We relate more to the discussion about the New Kingdom, and then I think it's the third intermediate period, where we actually had Libyans and Nubians controlling Egypt. And Egypt itself, by the way, it's a really complicated thing about how the structure of Egypt worked, because there were provinces, and each province or cataract had its own district ruler. There were a lot of military rulers, but then there was also a pharaoh. And there were even periods where you could talk about more than one pharaoh. There's a pharaoh of the north and pharaoh of the south. And this is why there's the border of Egypt, which, if I'm not mistaken, is mentioned here as well in this chapter, and or somewhere else. No, I think it's somewhere else. And the thing that we have about Egypt is the fact that Egypt kept on battling over control of this bridge known as the Levant, which the land of Israel falls in. And we have a lot of Egyptians showing up on the land of Israel throughout the centuries, but by around the time of somewhere around the 11th century BC, more or less, Egypt kind of starts retracting, and we see Philistines showing up here in areas where Egyptians used to be, and there's a certain point where basically Egypt kind of retracts into itself and no longer really influences land of Israel in the way it did earlier. And the thing that basically happens is that Egypt only every once in a while steps in and decides to be involved in things that happen here. Like one of the most famous and one of my favorite pieces, I've actually written about this on my website, HebrewInIsrael.net, about King Ahab. We actually have a monolith, the monolith of Kuruch, and it is a description of a battle against the Assyrians, Tiglath-Pileser I, in the year 853 BCE. Ahab is mentioned there. He's referred to as Ahab HaYisraeli, Ahab the Israelite. He leads a massive, he's one of the 12 nations, we'll call it, that led a war against Assyria. And Egypt, it's really funny, it only mentions that they sent something like 1,000 foot soldiers. And I kind of noticed it's kind of consistent with the Egyptians that unless they felt there was an actual threat against them, they never really did anything. They never really stepped up and did anything. And this is why when we read about the power of this Pharaoh or that Pharaoh, you have to take it with what we call a grain of salt, because there is enough information to prove that the Egyptians were not that great as much as you would think. There were places where the Egyptians literally lied through their teeth about stuff. And one of the most famous cases is after the Battle of Kadesh in the 15th century BCE. We actually have two separate accounts of that battle. Unlike some of the descriptions that we have, which only come from one side, here we have both sides, and both sides claim that they won. Funny enough, Ramses II, who led the army, was almost killed, and he was saved because someone jumped in and saved him. But Ramses was almost killed, and in truth, Hattusili III, the Hittite king, end up making an agreement with Ramses II. But if I'm not mistaken, there's a letter where Hattusili kind of basically hints at the idea of, let's both admit the fact that you basically were almost killed, and you didn't really win this. You kind of lost this. And this is really something very, very important. Why is this important? And we actually, in this chapter, we read about the hubris of Pharaoh. One of the problems that we have with Egypt is that the Egyptians would never admit defeat. And they never admitted when they made a mistake, and they never admitted when something didn't work out. We do have people from the outside, like, for example, the very famous prophecy or papyrus of Ipoal, where there's this discussion, could this be a description of the Exodus, the rivers turned to blood, stuff like that. There's a whole debate over that, if it's a prophecy, if he's describing something happening at the time, if it's just a letter of complaint. There's loads of different opinions about this, but a lot of people like quoting the Ipoal papyrus because and there, by the way, there are different ways of pronouncing his name, by the way, because we don't fully understand the vowel point system of Egyptian. I actually have a professor who's an expert in Ramesside Egyptian, which is the Egyptian most people learn in the beginning, and he teaches it. And I asked him about this, and he said, we think it might be this or might be that because of the fact that we don't fully understand the vowel point system in Egyptian, so we kind of guess here and there. And it's apparently very, very difficult to read hieroglyphs. It's much more complicated than people think. And this is why there was a need to invent an alphabetic system, because it made more sense. Someone took hieroglyphs, simplified the concept, made it into an alphabetic system. You need to know the language, but if you see a symbol, you know that's an aleph, that's a bet, that's a gimel, and so on. And eventually what happens is that we start getting a much better picture of who the Egyptians were. And there's a really interesting statement that I read by Hofmeyr, who wrote a book about the Israel and Egypt, I think it's called. And he mentioned something really interesting in the introduction of the book, where he says, the reason we don't hear about an Exodus in Egypt is because the Egyptians just didn't care. I want to extend what he says there. And I want to say, well, first of all, Hofmeyr is an Egyptologist, very famous Egyptologist as well. He's been a very outspoken supporter of the idea that there was an Exodus, and he actually, one of the very, very few voices out there in academia, who are people who actually considered to be big, who talks about that Exodus did happen, there was a Moses, and it's all real, but his work focuses on the fact that there's a lot of, and he's not the first one to write this. I mean, he wrote this. I've seen other scholars write very similar books. There's a scholar here in Israel called Dr. Pnina Begal-Paz, who wrote a book that I rarely see. I've never really seen anyone quote that book that much, except for here and there. And she does a very similar thing where they both go into Egyptian culture and say, well, look, we can find the story of Joseph and Exodus and everything. We can find terminology, ideas, concepts which appear in Egypt and only belong to that period in Egypt, which means the possibility of someone writing this several hundred years later is improbable, because it will require them not only to know Ramesside Egyptian, which was the basis of the Egyptian that came later on, but wasn't exactly the same. It also required them to have knowledge of what happened in Egypt in earlier periods, which means they had to go down to Egypt and read hieroglyphs off of walls in different temples in Egypt, which would require a massive quantity of work, basically a huge research, which people didn't tend to do back then, as far as I know. There were no classic historians like we have today of people who actually collected information and kind of pieced everything together. By the way, the first Egyptian historian that, or at least as far as I know, the first historian to really try to reconstruct the history of Egypt is Menethon. And Menethon was a priest who, an Egyptian priest of Amun, I think he was. He lived in the 3rd century BCE, and he tried to compose a history. And because of him, we have 30 or 31 dynasties in Egypt, which messes up the entire timeline when it comes to the Bible. And there have been scholars, specifically Emanuel Velikovsky, who was not an Egyptologist or anything, but he was one of the first people I ever read that raised the question of, could it be that there were less dynasties, that there were only 25 dynasties, and Menethon made stuff up. We also know that Menethon, by the way, also claimed that Egypt had already been in existence for about over 7,000 years prior to his time life, which we know is not true because we know the history. So, but still, going back to this, the more important subject is that reconstructing the history, knowing these things about Egypt hundreds of years later is considered to be an improbability, and therefore that this material was recorded in one way or another, and that's a whole debate by itself, but one way or another, much earlier than some scholars try to put it. Now, what is this whole thing about the hubris of Egypt? So hubris of Egypt is the fact that Egypt, as I said earlier, would not admit defeat over anything, and they always thought that they're always going to win. Now, it's very important to understand that Egypt had a lot of back and forth with its power, but not only that, Egypt actually eventually lost a lot of its power after the Battle of Al-Taqi. Al-Taqa, there's a whole bunch of different names to it. And this was a very, very pivotal battle, because in this battle, Egypt actually lost to the Assyrians. Basically, what happened was that during times of Sancheriv, so this is around the 7th century, end of the 8th century, beginning of the 7th century, the Egyptians were under threat by Sancheriv, and they went to a war against him in a place called Al-Taqi, and they lost this. This was actually a battle with Tirhaka or Tarhaka, who was a Nubian pharaoh. So this is where we have this misnomer about the Egyptians always being black. There was a whole hubbub that happened after a certain movie came out, and all the actors there were white, or most of the actors were white. It is actually important, by the way, to point out that there were white people in Egypt. It's a really interesting thing. They were considered to be foreigners. They are described differently, but it's still very, very important to understand that Egyptians themselves were ethnically a very, very, very mixed group. There were people from all over the place. Now, what happened was that Sancheriv actually records this in the very famous Sancheriv prism. It's like a column with several sides, and he actually describes Chizkiyahu, the Judean, Ezekiel. I think he's referred to as Ezekiel because they didn't have but the Syrian lost its ha sound. So Ezekiel, the Judean, and they actually went, and the Egyptians were called into the battle because of the people of Ekron, the Philistines, because some of the Philistines went with the Assyrians and some of the Philistines didn't. And apparently, this is how Sancheriv describes it, the people of Ekron, which is one of the Philistine cities, got very, very they were very concerned about the attack by Sancheriv, and they actually called the king. It actually refers in plural the kings of Egypt. So it means that besides Tarhaka, there were probably other leaders which were not really pharaohs. They were kings, meaning they were district kings, and they go out to war. And he also specifically mentions the king of Cush, the Nubians, which is Tarhaka, and they go all the way to a place called Al-Taka, and they have a battle there. And the Egyptians lose this. But what happens after losing this battle is that Egypt actually no longer really has any real footing in the land of Israel anymore. There were attempts to create or recreate the kingdom, and a couple of times they tried to do a whole bunch of things, but it didn't really work out for them. And the Egyptians basically were under the thumb of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And our chapter actually deals with the Babylonians. So just to give a perspective, the Battle of Al-Taka was somewhere around the year 701, 700. This is the times of King Hezekiah, and so on. So our reading today, because this introduction can go on, because this is my forte. This is my world, the world I've been studying for many years, the historical side of things. But basically, Egypt keeps on showing up a little bit each time as a possibility of getting rid of the Babylonians. To get rid of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. There were even during times of King Zedekiah. We read this in the book of Jeremiah. I think it's somewhere in the area of the last chapters of chapter 20s, like 27, 28. I don't remember exactly. And that's where Jeremiah actually has the whole thing where he tells him, you should surrender to the king of Babylon. And he has the whole fight with one of the false prophets, and Hananiah, the son of Azul. And basically what happens there is that the prophets are warning. Ezekiel, Yechezkel, and Yirmiyahu are both saying very similar things. They're saying, listen, they're not going to save you. You're not going to be able to defeat the Babylonians. Just surrender. And Yechezkel is giving a prophecy here to the king of Babylon. This is specifically Pharaoh Hophra. We're going to give the exact dates of what was going on here, but this is still a period, and Hophra is actually known to us. We know about him, we know about his kingship, we know details about what happened with him, and so on. And he potentially was a threat to the Babylonians because he was trying to revive Egypt. He was one of those pharaohs that tried to revive Egypt, and he actually wanted to attack the Babylonians, try to push them out of the area. We have to remember that Egypt, the mighty Egypt, was under the thumb of Babylon, Assyria, and then Babylon for a very long time. Really, in truth, we have to understand that after the Battle of Taka, Egypt never really regained its power anymore. It had moments where it kind of grew a little bit, but it never really went back to its original power. It was never really free. After the Babylonians came the Persians. After the Persians came the Hellenes. Egypt never really returned to be what it was earlier. But the religion of Egypt carried on. Egypt still was Egypt. There was still a pharaoh. It was just the pharaohs were never allowed to do certain things. They were basically, to some degree, vassals of Babylon. Now we're going to be reading from chapter 28, Ezekiel 28, verse 25, all the way to 29, 21. And just to give you a time frame, so this is the 10th year. He actually says this on the 10th year. This is the 10th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, which is this is in the year 587 BCE. And it's on the 12th day of the 10th month, which is surprisingly, I'm actually recording this not long before that date. That date happens a couple of days from now. And some scholars even give an exact date. This was 7th of January 587. They sometimes are able to produce dates like that. And this is just before destruction of the first temple. This is about 6 to 7 months before destruction or at least the beginning of destruction of the first temple. So that's the historical setting of where we're at. And this is actually part of a longer prophecy that starts. This is part of a longer prophecy that starts earlier, but the main reading that we're actually going to have is from chapter 29. We only have just a few verses from chapter 28, and we start with something positive where he says, listen, eventually the exiles go into end. So we actually start from chapter 28, verse 25, and he says, or you can even start from verse 24 if you go according to the Ammonites. Velo yihye od levet Yisrael silon mam'ir v'kotz machiv, and we no longer to the house of Israel silon mam'ir, which is a really, really unique term. It's a very, very rare term. Silon mam'ir seems to be some kind of a sharp object that causes pain. We have Salonim appears also in Judges. Sorry, in Ezekiel 2 verse 6, and also in we have the idea of very strong, very painful thorns, which also appears in Judges. We have it also in Judges 8:7. I will comb your. He says to them. He says to the relatives of Sukkot, I will comb your skin with the thorns. So thorns, if you've ever lived in the land of Israel, there are areas where there are a lot of thorns, and we're talking about Gideon or Yerubal, who says this to the dwellers of Sukkot when he's chasing down the Midianites. And if you ever lived in Samaria, for example, like I did for several years, there are places where there's some thorns. You get into an area of thorns, and it could hurt. It could really, really hurt. And if you get combed by these things, this is like a brush that if you comb something, you really cut someone. And it says silon mam'ir, which seems to be some kind of a thorn. Kotz machiv, a painful thorn. Mikol sivotam sho'atim otam, from all their surrounding who are sho'atim. Sho'atim is not a rare word, but it's a word for who despise you, who talk against you all the time. So anyone that surrounds them, this is very important because it gives you a context of Egypt, of Ammon, Moab, Edom, especially Edom in this period. They were taking over areas in southern Judea. And we also have the Babylonians in the north. And it says, Vayed'u ki ani Adonai Elohim, and they will know that I am the Lord God. How will they know this? Because he's going to do the following thing. Ko amar Adonai Elohim, thus says the Lord God, Bekabetzi et bet Yisrael min ha'amim asher nafotzu bam, when I gather the house of Israel from all the nations which they have been scattered there. V'nikdashti vam le'enei hagoyim, and I will be sanctified in their midst. Now, it could be by them or in their midst, but here, he doesn't use the word betocham, so here bam means that the fact that Israel is redeemed causes God's name to be sanctified before the eyes of the nations. Because Ezekiel has a prophecy where he talks about it, I will do for my own name's sake. So this is pretty consistent with that message. It says, Vayashvu al admatam, and they will dwell on their land, asher natati le'avdi le'Yaakov, which I gave to my servant Jacob. Now notice the beginning talks about Beit Yisrael, the end talks about Avdi Yaakov. This is an inclosion. He opens with one thing, closes with a very similar term. In this case, it's a parallel. It says, Vayashvu alea lavetach, and they will dwell upon it securely. No more enemies. Because we need to understand, he's talking about a period where there's enemies in the north, Assyria or Babylon by this point, even though I had a professor argue that the Syrians and Babylonians were basically the same people. They even more or less spoke the same language. Kind of one of the funny things that you have is when you study Akkadian, you think Akkadian, you're really studying is Old Babylonian, because Babylon was kind of like more important than Assyria. Assyria came to glory several times. Babylon was older, more or less the same type of people, more or less the same type of language, very similar religions. So a lot of people argue that there's not much of a difference between them. But the Assyrians were the empire, and then Babylon became the empire. This is why it was very important for some Assyrian kings to, when they actually controlled Babylon, to be named the Bel. It's called Bel. I try to remember how you say Babylon in Babylonian, which I think it's Balbil. Balbeli, I don't know. It's like the gate of the gods. So it's like Beit Ilum or Beit Il, something like that. No, not Beit Il, Bel Il, something like that. Or Bab Il. Yeah, that's the term I was looking for. I was missing a B. Bab Il or Bab Ilum, which means the gate of. Actually, should be Bab Ilim because it's a genitive form, and or Bab Ili is also a possibility. I've seen it in several forms, but I can't remember the exact name that Babylon is referred to in Akkadian. But they would try to refer to them as the Lord or Master of Babylon, or the King, or Sharum Babilum, the King of the Master or King of Babylon, because it was important for them. This was something that they were. This was something that was considered to be a great honor for these groups. It says, and they would dwell in peace. They will build houses and will plant vineyards. By the way, this is kind of parallel to the prophecy which we have in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says to them, he sends a letter out to Babylon and says, dwell there, build your houses, plant vineyards, marry off your children, have children there, because basically it's ki arukai, for it's going to be a long time. So Ezekiel is now saying the opposite. Eventually that's going to be reversed. It says, Ve'yashvu lavetach, and they will dwell peacefully. By me doing, when I do judgment, all those who spurn them and despise them are surrounding them. And they will know that I am the Lord their God. So he's basically repeating the same thing over and over again. He'll become sanctified in front of everyone because of his reaction, because of the fact that he defends his people. Now, technically, we're moving now to a different chapter. In this chapter, he's talking about one of the great powers. So, how does this relate to? First of all, it relates to our parashah, because it relates to the idea of God telling Egypt, "No, I'm going to bring my people out of Egypt." Period. But he's referring to the hubris of Egypt, the hubris of Pharaoh in our parashah, and the hubris of Pharaoh here. As I said, the pharaohs never wanted to admit that they were wrong or were defeated or that they were ever weak in one way or another. And here God, like in Egypt, says, I am going to drag you out here and I'm going to lay you to dry in the sun. This is almost literally what he says. And this is one of the people that surrounds him. What's really interesting is actually specifically Egypt technically is trying to come to the aid of Israel, because this was in the rebellions against the Assyrians. The Egyptians, even though historically speaking, as I mentioned earlier with Ahab, they only sent a small number of soldiers, this was actually an interest of theirs to try to beat the Babylonians out of here. So this is really a prophecy that's kind of interesting. It's a prophecy that is a warning to Egypt, but is also a warning to Israel, saying, don't trust Egypt. We actually hear multiple times, don't trust Egypt, don't trust Egypt, don't trust. We hear this in different prophecies throughout the three larger prophecy books. So this subject against Egypt actually carries on all the way to chapter 32, and so this is what we can call like a lump of prophecies, or a section of prophecies that relate specifically to Egypt. It starts in chapter 29 and ends in chapter 32. It says, verse 1 says, B'shana ha'asirit ba'asiri b'shneim asar l'chodesh. That's the date I mentioned earlier, the year 587 BCE, the 12th day of the 10th month. So this is the 10th year of the exile of Yehoiachin. On the 10th, on the 12th day of the month, and we said that there's a calculation that kind of puts this somewhere around the time of January 7th. It says, Hayad devar Adonai la'emor, the word of the Lord was to me, saying, Ben Adam, son of man. I've already spoken about the fact that the reason he's referred to as son of man is probably because he saw the chariot. He saw something that most people would never expose to, so he keeps on being reminded, you're just a human being. Sim panecha el paro melech Mitzrayim. Turn your face, basically, as if you're turning your face towards Egypt. So he's all the way in Babylon. He needs to kind of like presumably turn his face down south or southwest. But also, lasim panim is to direct one's attention. Usually, lasim panim, if it appears with the word lehair or light in some way or another, it's positive. Seir simpanecha is really more direct your attention, direct your thought, direct your actions towards. So place your face, which is an idiomatic expression, that really means draw your attention to there. El Paro Melech Mitzrayim, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. It's interesting that he's not really mentioning his name, but historically we know it was Hophra. V'inaveh alav al Mitzrayim kula, and prophesy about him and all of Egypt. So this specific prophecy, this part of the prophecy the first part focuses mostly on Pharaoh, but later on he actually talks about Egypt itself. But he says this is the opening of this entire segment of these, so we have 29, 30, 31, the four chapters that deal with Egypt. Okay? So this is the opening. Daber ve'amata, verse 3, speak and say, Ko amar Adonai Elohim, thus says the Lord God, Hini alecha Paro melech Mitzrayim. By the way, I pronounce it Hini. You'll probably hear a lot of people saying Hineni. That is another way of pronouncing this, but it's a grammatical error that developed in Spain about 700-800 years ago and was solidified by Rabbi David Kimchi. This actually should be pronounced Hini, according to the Masorite. So Hini alecha Paro melech Mitzrayim. Behold, I am upon you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Hatanim hagadol, the great crocodile. Harovetz betoch ye'orav, who dwells inside his water pools. Now, ye'or actually relates to the Egyptian term iru or itru, which really means river. Really, it's a term it's used to indicate the Nile. But because the Nile has also several branches that come out of it, that's why I use the plural ye'orav. Asher amar li ye'ori v'ani asitini, who has said, the Ye'or is mine and I have made it. I have made myself. V'ani asitini. This is about the pharaohs believing that they're gods. And he's basically telling him, you're not a god. So this is very, very important because this also reminds us of the parashah, because Egypt, first of all, the Egyptians always believed the pharaoh was a god. He was, I think they saw him as the physical manifestation of Horus when he's alive, and when he dies, he becomes something else or something like that. But they actually believed that they were gods. And some commentators say it actually means the Nile is for me, and I have made it for myself. And the form asitini is considered to be a rare use of the pronominal suffix of I. Asitini is meaning for me. So there are two ways of reading this. Why specifically talk about the Nile? Because the Nile is the life source of Egypt. It was also considered to be a god. And also, if you reach the Nile, you've basically defeated Egypt. If you're able to control the Nile, then Egypt has no power. They lose the delta, they lose all the agriculture, they lose the fishing, they lose everything. So he says, "V'natati chachim belchayecha." I will place hooks in your cheeks. V'idbakti dagat yorecha b'kaskesotecha, and I will stick the fish of your Nile, of your water bodies, to your scales. Now, a crocodile doesn't really have scales. It really refers to the outer flesh of the crocodile, which is made of like these patches that look like scales. I will draw you out from your Nile, because, by the way, hunting crocodiles, I've seen very old drawings of crocodile hunting and stuff like that. This was a very, very dangerous sport. This, by the way, fits a little bit to what the Assyrian kings would do, or the Assyrian Babylonian kings will do, that they will go out and hunt wild animals. We actually have from the Assyrian kingdoms, the Assyrian palaces and the cities, and Babylonian as well. We have these hunting scenes where they hunt lions and other wild animals. So it sounds as if, I'm going to send the king of Babylon, and I'm going to send Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to hunt you the same way the Babylonians hunted wild animals. So I will draw you out of your Nile. This is one of the things you have to go down a little bit and then be able to catch them. And he continues parallel what he said earlier, and all the fish of your Nile will be glued to your scales. And I will abandon you, I will throw you into the desert. And all the fish of your Nile, basically going to dry you out, you're going to die. On the face of the field you will fall, which basically means, means to be killed in battle. You will not be gathered, you will not be collected, and will not be gathered. To the birds of the To the animals of the field and the birds of the heavens, I've given you for consumption. Basically, we said you're going to lose, and you're dead. You're going to have to run away from the battle so badly that you are going to have to leave your dead behind for scavenger animals to eat. And all the dwellers of Egypt will know that I am the Lord. And this is the point. That they need to understand that God governs history. All these nations, they come up, they go down, they do this, they do that, but God is the God of history. He is the God that controls what's going to happen. And you can boast as much as you want, but as long as He doesn't want you to do so, you are not going to do it, period. And He says, Yan heyotem mish'enet kaneh levet Yisrael. And now He says, because they were a cane to lean upon for the house of Israel. He uses specifically the term kaneh, which is basically a hollow type of reed that breaks. And this is one of the prophecies, a very famous prophecy, where he says, Betofsam, this is verse 7, Betofsam becha vekaf terotz. When they grab a hold of you, the palm of the hand you will cut. If you try to lean on these things, first of all, they splinter very easily, and they cut your hand. Hand represents ability to do things. So they're expecting Egypt to show up using a cane. Now, this is really important because there's a symbolic issue here that the Pharaoh, one of the ways you mock Pharaoh, there's a really interesting difference in the way you mock Pharaoh and you mock chieftain. The reason I know this is because I've been doing research on certain hieroglyphs. And when you have a Pharaoh, Pharaoh's name appears in some of the cartouches, which is a drawing with the Pharaoh. It's like a square or an oval shape that has the name of the Pharaoh. And usually, in many cases, you'll see like a shepherd's staff, like the famous partial shepherd's staff that you see the pharaohs hold. And it's very interesting that he uses the term a kaneh here because it slightly resembles the idea of that cane that the pharaoh will hold. So that cane, which is supposed to represent his strength and power, actually will break and cut their hand, which the hand represents ability to do things. So not only are they not going to be useful as a cane because they're made from a reed, they're also going to harm the house of Israel's ability to defend themselves against the Babylonians. So it's a double jeopardy. It's a double damage that it's going to not only not be useful, it's going to harm them. It says uvakata lahem kol katef, and you will crack to them, you will cut for them all shoulders. When they lean upon you, you will break. When you cause them to stand on their hips, basically either fall on their side and be on their hip, or break down and basically be hip height because they're going to be on the ground. The whole idea is that you lean on this, your shoulder loses. Your hand loses control. You get cut. Your shoulder loses place. Shoulders is also sometimes being able to, when you shoulder with someone, the symbolic idea of being able to help someone by shouldering with them. You're not going to shoulder with them. Actually going to call them to break their shoulders. A lot of this symbolism is very, very, very precise. So he says to them, Lachen ko amar Adonai Elohim. Therefore says the Lord God, Hinni mevi alecha harev. I bring upon you a sword sort of symbolic to war. I will cut off from you, I'll kill from you man and beast. Probably means the horses, not the cattle and everything, because that actually take that as loot, but the animals, the horses of war. The land of Egypt will be desolate and destroyed. And they will know that I am the Lord. This is again, they will know, but in truth, the message here is to Israel, and they will know that I am the Lord. It doesn't help you all these plans, because you have to understand this was during a period where the Babylonians were on siege on Jerusalem. This was a lost, how do you call it in America? Americans call it the lost Hail Mary, I think Americans call it. Where it's a lost thing, a lost result that they might have to try to get away from this situation. And he keeps on saying, and they will know I am the Lord. Who is really the one supposed to know I am the Lord? Is not just, I already hinted at who it is, but it's Israel, but it's not just the Egyptians and the Babylonians and so on, because they would hear about these prophecies. For example, Jeremiah, Nebuzaradan, the head of the army, says, you're Jeremiah. So he saves Jeremiah because they know about his prophecies. So when the Babylonians hear that the prophet of Israel sits in Babylon near the river of Kvar, and he's telling them prophecies, you're going to succeed, they're going to attribute this to the God of Israel. But this is, I would say, the main direction of this would be towards Israel, saying, listen, you need to understand, I've already decreed what's going to happen. You just need to surrender to me by doing what I told you. It says, Yan Amal, but he goes back to point out to the hubris of Egypt. Yan Amal, because he said, Ye'or li v'ani asiti. Here we get a much more clear statement. The Nile is mine, and I have made it. Lachen hini elecha ve'el yorecha. Therefore, I am to you and to your Nile. V'natati et to you, meaning I'm now going to act against you, upon you. V'natati et eretz Mitzrayim lecharavot chorev shemama. And I will place the land of Egypt to destruction, dryness, and desolence. Mimigdal Savaneh v'ad Gevul Kush, from the Tower of Savaneh all the way to the border of Kush. Now, the border of Kush is very well known to everyone. Anyone who studies Egyptian history knows that they always expanded south towards Ethiopia, Nubia, Sudan, the Horn of Egypt. The Tower of Savaneh is a really interesting location. It's supposed to be somewhere. Actually, Migdol Savaneh ve'ad Gvul Kush. So it should be read that Migdol is in the north of Egypt, Savaneh is the south, near the border of Kush. So when I first read it, I misread it. It's Migdol, and then Savaneh, north and south, and then it specifies Ad Gvul Kush, which clarifies that Savaneh is all the way down south, near the border of Kush, which is basically Ethiopia, Nubia, and so on. So basically, all of Egypt, from north to south. But he's taking some of the larger borders that might be. Okay, we're not talking about the smaller version of Egypt. Actually, we're talking here about the original largest borders. This is very similar to the idea from Dan to Beersheba, from all the way north of Israel, all the way to the most southern place in Israel. It's a very similar idea. It says, Lo ta'avor bah regel adam, the foot of a man will not walk through it. And this is probably hyperbole. Okay, this is people still lived in Egypt. Egypt still existed, but he's trying to say Egypt will not have the same power it had. Because historically speaking, it didn't happen specifically in this way. So we have to sometimes be a little careful how we read certain verses. When I remember when I was younger, back in my teens, I read this and said, oh, okay, Egypt was desolate for 40 years. But really what he's saying here is for about a generation they won't recover. Egypt recovers a little bit after this. It's a really interesting discussion, by the way, how these numbers are used, maybe some other time. But it's a really interesting discussion about what these numbers, 70 years of Jeremiah, 40 years here, the years mentioned in the book of Daniel, what these numbers really represent. Is a really interesting discussion that's quite complicated. And he says, V'regel be'ema lo ta'avor ba, so the foot of a beast will not walk through it either. Meaning that man and beast, we had man and beast earlier, will die. Now man and beast are going to be non-existent in Egypt. Really means Egypt is going to be so weakened that it's going to be as if no one's doing anything there. V'lo tishav 40 shana, will not dwell for 40 years, but we know that it did dwell. It means 40 years is basically a generation and a half. It will take Egypt to really recover from the destruction that the Babylonians are going to put upon them. 40 years can also be maybe seen as the reign of a king or something, even though there were pharaohs that reigned only for a few months. There were pharaohs that reigned for a few years, and there's also obviously Ramses II, who reigned, I think, for something like 67 years or something like that. Okay, so 40 years is either the time of a generation or a time of one king or maybe two kings. It means it'll take Egypt some time to recover. V'natati et eretz Mitzrayim shemama, no place in the land of Egypt desolate. This word shemama appears over and over and over again. It says betoch aratzot neshamot, within the midst of empty lands. Which means that other lands are probably going to be affected by this Babylonian attack. Ve'area betoch arim mecharavot tihyena shemama 40 shana. Its cities, in the midst of destroyed cities, it will be desolate for 40 years. Same principle. Other places are going to be destroyed, but it's going to be a period, and then they're going to recover. He uses a relatively short period of time here, 40 years, relatively. So this is about there will be a recovering soon enough. והפיצותי את מצרים בגויים ורזרתים בארצות. I will scatter Egypt in the nations, and I will like seeding, וזרתי, I will see them, I will send them out like a seed. I will send them like a seed in the lands. It's quite possible people did flee Egypt and went to other places as well. It's quite possible. כי כה אמר אדוני אלוהים, for thus said the Lord God, מקץ 40 שנה, at the end of 40 years, אקבץ את מצרים מן העמים אשר נפוצו שמה. I will gather Egypt from the nations which they scattered there. Some of them fled to Libya, some of them maybe even to Greece, some to probably Arabia, and even southwards towards the Horn of Africa. I will gather them from the nations which they scattered there. Veshavti et shavut Mitzrayim, and I will bring back the returnees of Egypt. Vashivoti otam eretz Patros, I will bring them back to the land of Patros, which is a really interesting term. It's really an Egyptian Patarasi, the southern land. This is basically a reference to the southern lands of Egypt, because Egypt was actually Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. So Upper Egypt was actually south, Lower Egypt was actually north. So we're talking about Upper Egypt. There might be some connection here to where the central temples and central cities were during this period. We also have an inscription by Sarchadon, who calls himself the king of Egypt, the king of Paturisi, king of Cush. So Lower Egypt, what's very interesting is Lower Egypt is considered to be more of the heartland of Egypt. It's more the center in different periods, and probably was a center during this period. This is why he focuses on this area. Al eretz mechuratam, on the land of their belonging, really means their homeland. Vayusha mamlacha shefela, but there will be there a weak, a low kingdom. They won't be as powerful as they were. Min hamamlachot tiyeh shefela, from the kingdoms it will be low. Now this is a question if it means the lowest or it will be amongst low kingdoms. Velo titnaseh od halagoyim, and it will no longer uplift itself over the nations. V'im atim levirti redot bagoyim, and I will make them small, little. I will decrease them so they will not control over other nations. Velo yeh od levet Yisrael lemivtach mazkir avon, they will no longer be the house of Israel for a mivtach. Now, it's an interesting question what this term mivtach actually means. The mivtach seems to be connected to the idea of that they will no longer be a source of trust for Israel, and also says mazkir avon, a reminder of sin, because of their distrust of God, and they went to Egypt for seeking help instead of listening to the prophets. Bifnotam acharem, when they turned behind them, after them, meaning following them, seeking their help. V'yad'u ki ani Adonai Elohim, and they will know that I am the Lord God. So this is a term that repeats itself over and over and over again. Now he actually gives us the next part, basically verses 17 to 21, which is the end of this reading. He mentions a very specific event where Nebuchadnezzar actually goes against Egypt, because he worked and conquered these different places, but he was unable to get the amount of loot that he was looking for. So this is a prophecy that's said after the battle on Tzol. And the siege on Tzol went on for a very, very, very long time, about 13 years, from the year 585 to around 571, and Tzol was never really fully conquered. This is why they were able to hold up for 13 years. So when he went against Tzol, he didn't really have anything to offer. Tzol was only conquered around the year 568, 67, and he never really conquered Egypt by this point, but there was a lot of damage. what really happened was Egypt really fully lost, and was completely conquered by the Egyptians around the year 525 by Kambuzi, who was one of the last Babylonian kings. But Kambuzi, if I remember correctly, very shortly after that, lost to the Persians, and the Persians took over Egypt. So they tried. So this is something described around the year 571. He actually says Vayhi be-27 shana barishon b'echad l'chodesh, and it was on the 27th year, which seems to be 27th year from the exile of Yehoiachin, on the first of the month. On the first month, so this is the beginning of the new year in the biblical calendar, which some people identify as being the 26th of April 571 BCE. They just finished the siege on Tyre. They were unable to conquer it, so they turned to Egypt, according to this prophecy. It says, Hayad Vara Adonai Elai Lemor, the word of the Lord was to me, Ben Adam, son of man, Nebuchadrezzar. So he's referred to as Nebuchadrezzar, not Netzar. And there's a nun resh switch that happens between Hebrew and Babylonian. His name was actually Nabu Utsur something or other. So the resh does exist there in his name in the original Babylonian. So Nebuchadrezzar melech Bavel he'evir et chaylo avoda gedola el tzor. So Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, He'evid, sorry, I said He'evir, accidentally, it looks similar. He'evid chaylo avoda gedola el tzor. He made his, He'evid is a hifil form, so he made his army do a great work upon Tyre. Kol rosh mekorach v'chol katef meruta. All heads are bald, and all shoulders are in a state of weariness. V'sachar lo haya lo urchelo mitzo, and there was no payment to him and his army from Tyre, ala avodah asher avad aleha, for the work that he worked upon it. Lachen ko amar Adonai Elohim, therefore says the Lord God, Hini noten le Nebuchadrezzar melech Bavel et eretz Mitzrayim. Behold, I give Nebuchadrezzar, the king of Babylon, the land of Egypt. V'nasa hamonah u'shalal shelalah u'vazaz bizah. He will carry its people, and will take away its loot, and will steal its stealing. But bizah is loot, but that's done. So you have shalal, which is really the bounty, and then shalal bizah, which is really the loot. Vayta sachar lechalon will be a payment to his army. Pu'ulato asher avad ba, the work that he worked upon it, the army. Natati lo et eretz Mitzrayim, I give to him the land of Egypt. Asher asuli neum Adonai, which they have done to me, the word of the Lord. Now, they have done to me probably relates to the fact that it's a very difficult sentence. You can say that Egypt has done this because of what Egypt did, therefore they're being punished, or as a gift to Babylon because Babylon is doing God's will. It's a very, very difficult verse. Commentators have difficulty with this verse. And I have to correct something I said earlier, because the dates didn't work in my head, and I couldn't realize it. Kambuzi, I was looking at my notes, and I misread my notes. In 525, Kambuzi, who was a Persian king, not the last Babylonian king. The last Babylonian king was someone else. Kambuzi, in the year 525, who was a Persian king, not a Babylonian king, conquered Egypt completely. But the Babylonians had a certain level of sovereignty over Egypt after the Battle of Takeh, which Assyrians and then the Babylonians. And then he ends here with this whole idea, and this is how this all connects, because Egypt will be defeated. God goes to war against Egypt in our parashah. So he ends and he says, Bayomahu, in that day, Atzmiach keren levet Yisrael, I will grow a horn. Horns were a symbol of strength, but keren here also means can relate to strength, or keren can be sometimes refer to the idea of a keren, of the corner of a building growing up. I've seen someone make the argument before. But keren usually refers to the power, strength. Horns were symbol of strength, unlike the symbolism that you find later on in European art and so on. I actually wrote an article about this, which unfortunately really, really confused some people, because everyone keeps on thinking about the devil has horns, presumably. This is how Christianity usually presents it, and other cultures as well. The jinn, some of the Egyptian devil kind of has horns. The jinn some of them have horns and so on. So a lot of people associate devils and so on, and so they say with horns, but really horns are considered to be a symbol of strength and power. And when I wrote this article, I kept on getting these emails from different people saying, we don't understand, wait, horns, isn't that evil? No, horns we're not considered to be evil. They were considered to be actually a positive symbol of strength and power. So I will grow a horn to the house of Israel. They will have horns, basically strength. And to you I'll give an opening of a mouth. Pitchon peh is an idiomatic expression, means the ability to answer. You'll be able to say things. Now, meaning that you'll have the ability to come back, because Ezekiel was being taunted by the people. People were making fun of him. They were expecting Egypt to win. And after Egypt will lose, everyone will go like, oh, Ezekiel was right. And everyone will turn to him and say, okay, now we want to listen to you. Because if I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of the book, he actually says that he won't talk for a while. They will know that I am the Lord. Now, this last reading here, he says, and they will know I am the Lord, is really the center of everything. It's knowing that he is the Lord, knowing that he acts through history, knowing that he controls history, knowing that the loyalty to the God of Israel is in the center of everything. Do what he says. Don't start doing all your weird calculations. Man has many thoughts, but the advice or the plan of God will be what will stand. And that's really the center of this discussion. The same thing with Egypt. Moses stands before Egypt and says to them, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to do so. So he says, you're going to learn a lesson. You're only a human being. You're not the power in the universe. And we have this hubris today as well. Have people who try to say, we are the gods, we are doing this. I actually seen people actually write that human beings are the gods, which is by itself a hubris, because we die. We're not gods, period. But I've seen certain religions try to talk about human beings being gods. Some cultures, like the Hittites, the Egyptians, believe that when a pharaoh died or a king died, he became a god. And it's making a point that mankind needs to understand that he's part of a larger idea where God wants to be sovereign and king over all of mankind. And he uses historical events, and then later on talks about that history to teach us about his sovereignty over the world. So you might see something this happening, this nation thinks they're all strong, and the other nation thinks they're strong, and we always have nations that do this. But if they look back and they learn the history, because the history of God, or the theology of the theological discussion about God, is really how God acts in history. And God appears over and over again and says, look, I did this, I did that. Learn from these actions. Learn from these I'm in control. And this is the message to Egypt throughout history as well, because Egypt thought they were the most powerful, and we can replace the name Egypt with other places. But the point is for mankind to understand, mankind is not sovereign, mankind is not king, mankind is not God. I hope you enjoyed this recording. If you want to support Hebrew in Israel, you can go to the website HebrewInIsrael.net. You can click on the donate button. All these recordings are given out free, even though there's research and there's material and everything. I put these teachings out for free so people can learn, to increase the knowledge, to increase the understanding. Like always, you can comment, you can correct things if I make a mistake. Correcting is never offensive, unless it's done in an offensive way. It's never offensive if I make a mistake, and I'm only a human being. I make mistakes. And I hope you enjoyed this. Most important thing is to share, to think, to understand, to discuss. I really get really beautiful messages from people sometimes that they really thank me for the work that I put into these things. And I'm very grateful for these messages. It helps me carry on, because it's a lot of work to do these things, but it's wonderful to do it. It's fun to do it. It's good to do it. And I know it helps people. And this is why I do it. Kol Tuv.